Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is fellow Forbes reporter, Sarah Mueller. Sarah, thank you so much for joining me today. Sarah, you are coming from us live from Des Moines, Iowa. Welcome to the first edition of Eye on Iowa. Why are we having this segment?
Well, Iowa has played a very important role in politics. I mean, since the 70s, we've had the first caucus of the campaign season, of the presidential election season. So now we have a lot of things shifting around with Iowa losing its first in the nation status, which we can get into later on why that's in quotations. But there's a lot of things moving and shaking right now with Iowa and with politics, specifically as it pertains to 2024's election. So we wanted to make sure we focused on what was happening on the ground here in Iowa, here in Des Moines, and around the state.
Let's get into the quotation marks you just did. Obviously, the first of the nation status is in contention. Iowa and the Iowa caucuses have been in the headlines now, swirling for months. Tell us about that.
Yeah, we have the first in the nation status since the 70s, as I mentioned. And I spoke to University of Iowa professor Tim Hagle, and he is an expert in all things caucus related. So while we were talking, he got into why our nation status is kind of up in the air because while the Democrats have voted not to start with us, Iowa has a law that says we need to be the first caucus. So it's kind of a game of chicken of what's going to happen next. You know, are we going to do it anyway or are we going to postpone? He kind of gets into the caveats and the loopholes that they could pull to still make everybody happy. But really, it's a waiting game right now.
I'm excited to watch and hear all about the interview. But first, as an Iowan yourself, I want to pulse check. What are people thinking on the ground right now in Des Moines about a year out from the caucus?
That's a really great question. First of all, we are a year out from the caucus, and something that Hagel gets into in our interview is that this is a short start to the season. We are a year away from the caucus, and we don't really have candidates coming in town yet, which is kind of unheard of. And so we're kind of, again, waiting around to see if some of these questions can get answered. And so some of these politicians know if they're going to spend time here yet or if they're going to wait. So right now, Iowans are kind of confused too, I think. We have also a lot happening after our last November election where all of our seats turned red. But as Tim will say, he still firmly believes that we are a purple state. We are a swing state. And so we still are important to the pulse of the nation, as you would say. But as far as that goes, I think Iowans are just kind of waiting with bated breath of what's going to happen next. You know, we've always kind of made jokes about how many politicians come in town and how they take over our coffee shops and stuff. But I think we're really going to miss it if we do lose that contact with politicians.
I could imagine. And you mentioned that there is a waiting game, but when's the deadline? When can you wait no longer and you're either boots on the ground in Iowa or you're moving on?
That is an excellent question because we really don't know. There's a lot that's going to happen that Tim breaks down here in the next couple of months that's going to make some decisions for these political candidates. And it also depends on who announces, who decides that they're going to bypass us or not. But we've also seen politicians here in the last couple of years bypass Iowa completely. They'll throw up a couple ads, they'll throw up a couple billboards. The notorious one is Tulsi Gabbard, who left her billboards up for years after the election, and she clearly did not become our president. But there are a lot of people who bypass us because they don't think that they need or they're going to win Iowa. So it's going to be really, really interesting to see how this all unfolds.
I'm excited to see how it all unfolds, but why do you think there's always so much excitement and anticipation leading up to the caucuses?
Well, first of all, we're Iowa, right? People mistake us for Idaho, Ohio, Indiana, name it. You probably have heard it. But we're a small hometown, homegrown community. And so one thing Tim gets into is Iowa really weeds out the posers. Who is actually going to make it to the final rounds or who's going to be their nominees and who's not? You know, who's going to make the cut? And Iowans can kind of weed that out.
How can, as an Iowan, you sniff out a poser opposed to someone that you think, hey, I have my eye on that candidate. They have the potential to become the next president?
That's a great question. And I think it's different for everybody. But here in Iowa, we really focus on those kitchen table issues, as Tim Hagle will point out in our interview. And that's things like the economy, that's things like jobs, that's things like what's going on with ag. Obviously, that's important to us. What's going on with our public school system, things that are just in our neighborhood that we're talking about almost daily. So those are the issues that Americans are going to be asking about, and specifically Iowans. One of the most iconic examples of this is Jimmy Carter. You know, they say that when he came to Iowa, he was literally walking down the street and just introducing himself as, "Hi, I'm Jimmy Carter and I'm running for president." And there's this kind of saying that Iowans use, can you have a beer with this person, right? And maybe that's not everybody's credentials for a good president, but Iowans do look for, who can I sit down and talk about the issues with?
You mentioned that Iowa did turn red this past election. The person you interviewed, Professor Tim Hagle, said that he believes Iowa is still a purple state, but what are the issues that matter to Iowans today? Why is the state red as of now?
Well, there's a lot of different factors in that, and Tim will get really into the weeds on that one. But one of the major things is that he points out the registration is a key factor to us still being a purple state. We slightly have more registration when it comes to Republicans right now, but it's only a small fraction. There's still quite a few independents or Democrats registered. So we really are still spread across the board. And if you just look a couple of years back, even though Donald Trump performed well here in Iowa, so did Barack Obama. So we're going to see that a lot of these things will shift and change with the nature of things. But as far as issues go, well, agriculture is always going to be important to us. But like I said, those kitchen table issues are really what they're going to come down to. And that's something I think everybody across the board is going to have questions about, especially in regards to the economy.
Sarah, give us a preview of the inaugural Eye on Iowa segment.
Well, as I said, Tim Hagle is a great expert in his field. He has studied in and out the Iowa caucuses, and he's truly impeccable at explaining not only what the process is like, which we'll get into the difference between the Republican and Democratic process here in Iowa, but we'll also get into what does the future look like here in the next year, especially as it pertains to Donald Trump. What's the potential for Joe Biden? And we'll even look back at 2020 and see what went wrong for us to lose our first in the nation status.
I'm excited to hear that. I mean, I was there on the ground in 2020, so I'm excited for a little refresher course. But as a lifelong Iowan, did anything surprise you in this discussion?
I have been covering politics in Iowa for the last few years. I've covered a couple of caucuses now, but I'm really anticipating what these next couple of months are. I don't know exactly who is all going to announce. Obviously, we have our ideas, but really we should have people in Iowa already. So we're all kind of, again, holding our breath, waiting to see what happens, who's going to put boots on the ground first and see who's going to make a really good case. Because even one of the things that Tim Hagle said was that us waiting 5 days to release the caucus results in 2020 could have really hindered or made a lot of people's campaigns, because as we know, Joe Biden performed fairly well in Iowa in 2020. He came in fourth place, but when you delay those results by 5 days, they've already moved on. So what does this mean for our future here in Iowa, and especially as it pertains to the Republican candidates this time around?
Do you think in 2020 that delaying the announcement really took the wind out of Pete Buttigieg's sails?
Well, that's something Tim and I get into, but mainly, did it help Joe Biden? Essentially, because he didn't do too great. Pete Buttigieg did well. Obviously, he won, but Joe Biden coming in fourth, we didn't even know that till 5 days later, and they were already in New Hampshire. And, you know, they're still kicking off and going strong. So really, those results didn't make or break anybody, but it could have if it would have been released sooner.
Well, without further ado, welcome to the first edition of Eye on Iowa.
I want to look now at the upcoming 2024 election. We obviously have Donald Trump in the race, and he has had a close second in 2016 to Ted Cruz when he came for the caucuses. Now, he's also had the support of Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds, our senators Joni Ernst and Chuck Grassley, and they really threw their support behind him in 2016, 2020. What does his future in Iowa look like now coming into 2024?
It's a little bit hard to say how much support Donald Trump is going to have in Iowa or elsewhere as far as that goes. It's certainly, there have been a number of elected officials here in Iowa and elsewhere that have endorsed Trump or supported him in various ways, and particularly supported him in 2020. And that's not surprising. I mean, when you have an incumbent president, you're normally going to support that person unless you've got some particular beef with that person or whatever happens. Now, of course, we aren't sure what those folks were doing in 2016. Maybe they had supported somebody else, but once Trump was the nominee, they said, okay, this is our party. We may not particularly like all the things that he's done. One of the things that many people complained about Donald Trump was his style. And certainly some people, because Ted Cruz won the caucuses in 2016, that they probably, a number of elected officials probably supported him, but then again switched over to Trump, regardless of maybe, well, I don't care about his style, but his policies are good and we're going to support him, and then did so again in 2020. So that's not particularly surprising. But we still have to wait and see if he gets any competition. And there's certainly been some people that have been angling for that. It seems like former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley seems to be on the verge of announcing her candidacy. I think she's supposed to, on February 15th, indicate her campaign start in South Carolina and eventually make her way to Iowa. And that would be no surprise. She was here in Iowa for the 2022 campaign and helped a number of candidates who went on to victory. And so it's that whole thing where you're basically winning friends and influencing people, basically making those friends that can help you out when it comes time for your own campaign. So we'll see how that goes. Then, of course, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, what's he going to do? He seems to be fairly popular at this point, and in fact, polls better than Donald Trump on occasion. And it may be the type of situation where, well, DeSantis has the same policies as Trump, but doesn't have the style issues. And just a younger person. One of the things that even people are talking about with respect to Biden has to do with, well, the age factor. And Trump's up in age too, maybe not as old as Biden, but still, getting up there. Maybe he seems more vigorous than Biden. Some people are complaining about Biden, whether he's on the decline in some particular way. Well, whether that's true or not, still, do you want to have somebody that's a new leader for a new generation? It's maybe the way to characterize that. And that's something that Nikki Haley has actually said already. And so to some extent, Republicans are going to need to maybe find a way to, if they are supporting somebody else, to find a way to support that other person with hopefully the same policies from Republicans' perspective, without angering the voters who maybe support Trump and liked him the first time. Can you get those Trump supporters to say, yes, I like Trump, but maybe it is time to have a new candidate. Maybe Democrats did too good of a job of demonizing him in 2020, so let's have somebody else. Now, having said that, Trump, of course, did win Iowa by, I think it was about 8 points in 2020, 1 point less than what was his victory in 2016. So certainly he has a lot of support, particularly from those no party voters who aren't beholden to a particular party. So it's still a matter of looking for who might step into those shoes and again have the advantages of the policy things that concern those voters without some of the other aspects that might turn off a few others.
Now, you're talking about this style element. We all can kind of get what Donald Trump's style is, but maybe what other styles might we see? What other approaches to Iowa could we see in 2024?
Well, each candidate will have his or her own style. Some people are going to have a softer style and so forth. One of the things that seemed to make Donald Trump popular early on was his blunt approach, particularly to the media. And particularly this resonated with Republicans who have long felt that the media was against them, that it was far too liberal and didn't treat candidates from both parties the same way, that Democrats would often get a pass and Republicans were pilloried in the press. And this was something where Trump didn't seem to care and is willing to basically call them out and call it fake news and all this kind of stuff. And that seemed to resonate to a lot of people, in part because a lot of people, aside from Republicans in particular, after Trump got the nomination, when he's appealing to folks in the general election, a lot of those independents, that they just get tired of all the political infighting and say, look, enough of this. What are you going to do for me on those kitchen table issues, jobs, the economy, healthcare? where I'm spending a lot of money that I basically don't have because of, at least these days, high inflation, high gas prices. Talk to me about those issues. Quit whining about this other stuff. And so the Trump resonated and sort of hit a chord with those kinds of voters, again, particularly in the general election in Iowa and elsewhere as well. And so if a candidate can still maybe stand up to the press in various ways and basically call them out when they're not being fair or they're picking on one side and not the other side, and still do it in a way that maybe isn't quite so aggressive. So again, style points here. Again, every once in a while, Trump would say something that would basically irritate people in one way or another. And I can remember many times during the 2016 campaign where it was like, oh my goodness, Trump said this terrible thing. What are his chances now? And I'd be talking to reporters, asking questions. Well, it doesn't seem like he's maybe going to win, but he'd get past it because that's how his style was. So in that sense, Trump was kind of a one-off, that other candidates probably can't do that and really shouldn't do that. That kind of aggressive style that would try to get back to something where, look, I'm going to be blunt, I'm going to be fair though, and you have to treat me fairly or I'm going to basically take you to task for, you being the candidate taking the media to task for not doing their job the way many people see it.
Now, we saw just in this last election here in November, Iowa has historically been kind of a purple state, and now we are sweeping red. How do you think that's going to impact Iowa in the next election here in 2024?
I do a lot of work with voter numbers, that every month I look at the voter registration statistics. And in fact, even once or twice a week, I get an opportunity to see what the current changes are on a regular basis, given some of the work that I do. And one of the things that I always tell people is that Iowa is still a purple state. We're still a swing state. And the reason for that is that the three parties, Republicans, Democrats, and the no party voters, again, that's what Iowa calls its independents, are pretty evenly balanced. And in fact, up until the primary in 2020, no party voters were the most numerous and had been for 20 years, as far as the data that I was looking at goes back. There was a big change in the primary, the COVID primary, the pandemic primary, as I usually call it, because all the voters in the state were sent or at least all the active voters were sent a absentee ballot request form. Again, because of the pandemic, you didn't want it to minimize in-person voting to try to keep spread of the disease down and so forth. And so a large number, something on the order of 60,000 no party voters decided, oh, okay, I'll go ahead and participate in the primary for the Democrats or the Republicans. So their numbers dropped below that of both parties. But it was temporary, and they're building back because about half of the voters, new voters that register every week and every month are no party voters. A lot of those are young folks, so they haven't really made up their mind yet. Maybe they feel it's their civic duty to go ahead and register, but they aren't sure what party they want to join, so they say no party for now. And then over time, they usually pick a party, either because they joined a particular caucus or just because they like some particular candidate or party. So right now we're at a point where the Republicans have the lead by 60,000 or so voters over Democrats, but Democrats and no party voters are about even. In fact, if you include the Libertarians actually became an official party here after the 2022 elections. But if you throw them in, include them with the no party voters, that now they're ahead of Democrats. And so essentially, we still have a situation where you've got about a third Republicans, a third Democrats, and a third independents. And so those independents, they're the ones that decide the statewide elections, whatever they happen to be, and also pretty much the ones in the congressional districts as well. Maybe a little bit less so when you get down to the smaller state house districts and so forth. But they're the ones that candidates really have to reach out to in a general election. And so right now, the pendulum seems to have shifted to the Republican side. As you indicated, that we have, and in fact, in presidential elections, I'd like to remind people that Iowa went for Obama, in 2008 and 2012, but then it went for Trump in 16 and 20. And so it swings. It's those voters that swing from one side to the other. Now, right now, the pendulum seems to be on the Republican side. We had several statewide offices went for Republicans, including 2 long-term incumbents for Democrats were defeated. You had a congressional member that was defeated. The seat was flipped to a Republican. You had Republicans gain seats in the state House and the state Senate. But at some point, that pendulum is going to swing back. Those no party voters maybe will get tired of Republicans, or the issues will change, or whatever it happens to be. And so it's possible that it's going to swing back. So I will still argue, even though we seem to be leaning on the red side of purple at this point, that Iowa is still a purple state, still a swing state. And the key are those no party voters. Now, let me expand on that one little bit here, and you can maybe chop this up if you need to. One of the problems for Democrats is if they abandon Iowa and the Iowa caucuses are a tremendous party building event, not just on that night, but that year that goes ahead of time, where they have people out there talking to people, trying to convince them and so forth. And if we don't have that focus, then it's going to hurt Iowa Democrats. They aren't going to have that ability to build the party in the same way that they had in the past. And one of the concerns that the DNC had was the competitiveness of a state. And they would look at it and they would say, okay, Iowa's a red state. They would make that conclusion. Again, I think it's an incorrect conclusion, but that's what they were thinking, because it tends to be Republican at this point in terms of some of the races that have won. But they basically are saying, by the Democrats abandoning the Iowa caucuses, they're almost saying, well, we're just going to let Iowa go. We're not going to compete here as hard anymore. And that's something that the folks in New Hampshire Democrats have said the same essential thing, that basically they feel that the DNC is abandoning them. And basically you would have potentially 2 states that were swing states, Iowa and New Hampshire, that may end up in the red column on a more permanent basis.
Now, one thing you've mentioned to me in our conversation is that the ground game is really important to be successful. And when I reflect on some of the most recent elections, we've seen some candidates completely give up on Iowa, throw up some billboards, throw up some ads, and they don't even come. And so how is that going to change, or even start becoming more prevalent as we go into the next election, especially with what's happened here with our first in the nation status?
It's certainly true that usually a strong ground game is important if you're going to win the Iowa caucuses, but we have had instances where people have skipped it. John McCain is a famous example, that he ran twice, and both times he basically skipped Iowa. The first time he ran, showed up in Iowa for the 2 debates that were held here before the caucuses. The second time he basically said, no, I'm not going to win in Iowa, so I'm not going to spend my time there. So he focused on New Hampshire and states down the road, and it proved to be a successful campaign strategy for him in terms of getting the nomination, though, of course, he lost the election. More recently, Donald Trump in 2016, again, because he wasn't a politician, he had a different style. He also was a much more highly recognized person. He had that name recognition that most candidates don't have, plus the resources to back it up. And so he didn't need to have that ground game. And during that whole campaign, I was saying, well, he's not doing it. He's behind in this ways. Well, ultimately it proved successful for him. For other candidates, they're not going to be able to do that. Again, Trump was kind of a one-off, a very unusual type of situation in terms of who he was and how he was able to run a successful campaign here in Iowa, and at least in 2016 in terms of the general election. Normally, though, unless you have somebody that has extremely high name recognition, they would need to win Iowa, at least, they would need to come in with that strong ground game. And basically get those supporters to be able to get them to show up to a precinct caucuses. Now, again, if the Democrats are moving away from a caucus, they have to have a caucus because that's what the Iowa law says. There's not going to be a primary. But if they change how the caucus works, if they just end up mailing every Democrat a preference card or something like that, they're going to get a vote. They'll certainly find out who those particular voters support. But in terms of the depth of the energy behind it, it's just not going to be there. And I think it's going to be a problem, like I said. in terms of the Democratic Party going forward, whereas the Republicans, if they're still out there basically talking to people in the local towns, the small towns, rural areas all across the state to try to get their people to show up for their caucuses, it's going to perhaps convince more people, particularly those no party voters, to, hey, join our party.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a lot of different formats of this campaign technique take form. For example, the Iowa State Fair is one that stands out the most to me. Now, when candidates come here to Iowa in the next year or so, what is going to be their biggest hurdle here?
There's no particular hurdle that's unusual for 2024 in terms of campaign in caucus in Iowa. This is particularly true for Republicans because, again, they're going to have the caucuses like they normally would. So they're still going to have to do the things that a Republican candidate would normally come into. Sort of the external factor, of course, is the fact that Donald Trump is a former president and has that huge name recognition, has a base of supporters, many of whom are basically going to say it's Trump or nobody as far as they're concerned, because they see him as this non-establishment outsider type of person, which they like, which is why they supported him the prior to presidential elections. So they're maybe going to stick with him. But the question is whether any other candidate can peel off some of those supporters and get them to join their campaign, whoever it happens to be. For the Democrats, it's unclear what's going to happen, and maybe that's the problem that, or the obstacle that faces them, because we don't know exactly how the Democrats are going to run their caucuses. If it's going to be a mail-in campaign, I think there are going to be some problems along those lines. Who are they going to mail the cards to? Do people have to request the cards, or is everybody just going to be sent, every registered Democrat just going to be sent one? What about people that register late for the Democrats? How are they going to get their preferences counted? So there's a whole variety of issues that are going to go into it that basically makes it all a big question mark at this point. And so that can be a problem. Now, having said that, again, if Biden does decide to run for re-election, and if nobody challenges him, it gives Democrats an opportunity to work out any problems in the system without it really meaning a whole lot, meaning that, with Biden unchallenged, he's going to get the nomination. Then we'll see what happens in the general election, depending on who the Republican nominee is.